And thank you all for coming this afternoon in this January weather. It's good to have everybody here, and I appreciate it. This man led a truly adventurous life. But his career, his lifetime story, has been hidden for the best part of 160 years. And now, today, I'm in a position to share this story with you as a result of a donation of some of the documents that support this fellow's life. Paul Elbis from the Round Table in Milwaukee acquired these documents, donated them to the museum. Then Doug handed me the folder and said, "What do you think? Take a look at this fellow. What's he like?" And I found he had a series of opinions about guerrilla warfare, combat itself, slavery, emancipation, all kinds of issues connected with the American Civil War. When he became involved with the war, he wound up working with the Janesville Daily Gazette. It's a newspaper in Janesville, Wisconsin. He wound up writing something like 81 separate articles for the paper, and that formed the body of the material that I had a chance to look at. So today, let's work through his life together, and we'll see what kinds of things emerge from all of this. Let's see, here we go. First of all, he was born in 1829 in Monmouth, New Jersey. His father had fought in the War of 1812. His grandfather fought in the American Revolution. He was raised on a farm just outside of Monmouth, New Jersey. And he wound up going to what we call the common school, common education there, for a number of years. And then he moved to New York City. And we're looking at this picture and it says, okay, what does this have to do with? When he went to New York City for 5 years, from 1850 to about 1855, he worked for the New York City Fire Department. He wanted to be a firefighter. Why that is, I don't know. But he was very interested in doing this. So this is what we're looking at. In 1852, he married Elizabeth Combs, who was an immigrant from England. Together they had a daughter, Irene Elizabeth. That daughter, and she was born in 1853. That daughter wound up having 5 children, one of whom wound up in Cleveland in the 1920s. And I'll touch on that a little bit later in the presentation. But that granddaughter is important for all of this material. But now, Britton came to Janesville, Wisconsin in 1855. And one would ask, why would a fellow from New York City in the fire department come to Janesville, Wisconsin in 1855? So let's take a look at this. Here we have a painting done, German immigrant artist for Janesville itself. And you can see through Janesville here that a river runs through it. It's the Rock River. Somewhat similar in nature to New England and portions of New York, where you've got rivers flowing through, and they're using the power for the various industries, small town industries. Janesville, Wisconsin, in 1840, had all of 300 people in there. 1850, they had 3,000 people in there. And by 1860, they had about 7,000 people there. So Janesville was a growing community in south central Wisconsin. But if you look very closely at the picture, which is hard to do, it's a smallish picture, and I have a map of Janesville from roughly that period. If you look very closely, you see a lot of white buildings there, all made out of wood. Wood burns. In the mid-1850s, Janesville wanted to start a fire department. Well, if we take a look at this, this is fire equipment from the time. So we have a hand pumper up on the top left, which would draw water. So you put your hose in the Rock River or into somebody's well, you draw the water out, and then you hand pump this thing. You have to connect many, many feet of hose. And eventually they went to a steam engine that could heat up and throw the water a lot farther. So this was the sort of the technology at the time. They needed to hire somebody who knew something about fire equipment. So here was William Britton from New York coming to Janesville, and we see he becomes the first chief engineer for the fire department in Janesville. So by 1857 to 1861, this is what he was doing. This equipment, by the way, these are photographs of actual Janesville Fire Department equipment. They had this from about the late 1850s to the 1880s. So you can see the top right hand, you've got a wagon devoted only to hoses. The bottom right, hook and ladder, when buildings were burning. Bottom left was the steam pumper. That thing could draw water from about 400 feet through the hose and shoot it another 200 feet to put out the fire. Somebody needed to understand the mechanics of all of this, and that's where Britton came in. So this is what he was doing in Janesville. He was also a carpenter, and he wanted to start his own furniture business. So all this was going on at the same time. Let's see here. 1861, though, April 12, Fort Sumter, Civil War starts, and in Janesville, it's this business of Lincoln was calling for 75,000 volunteers. So Janesville indeed recruited a company to go with the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry, and they went off east to fight at First Bull Run in their white-gray uniforms. And again, if you go downstairs and across the hall, you can see somebody from the 2nd, mannequin, the 2nd Wisconsin, in this uniform. So you have the gray uniforms throughout portions of Wisconsin, and certainly with the 2nd. Company from the 5th Wisconsin was also recruited. They went east, did not see combat. The problem, though, with the companies that went east is that you also have First Bull Run, the first battle, major battle of the Civil War, fought in 1861 in July. And of course, the Union lost that battle. Lincoln's call then went out for 300,000 volunteers. Now we come back to Janesville. In Janesville, to begin with, we have this fellow, Britton. We have a newspaper article talking about this. And the article says as follows: the people who signed a list to enroll themselves into a company to serve in this war met at the courtroom this evening and came to order by the appointment of William B. Britton as chairman. After a few remarks from the chairman, the name of the Janesville Fire Zouaves as the title of the company was adopted. It was moved and seconded that these proceedings be published in the city papers. And after this time, Britton made an arrangement with the Janesville paper, the Daily Gazette, that he would write articles about his work with what became Company G of the 8th Wisconsin. And the 8th Wisconsin is also connected, as is later known, the Eagle Regiment. We'll be talking about that in a second. The unit goes to Camp Randall in Madison. Britton writes, the regiment have been out for the past 2 days near the university firing blank cartridges. Each man takes 10 rounds. We fire first by division, by wing, by company, right and left oblique, by file. The boys enjoy the sport very much. So what you have here is very detailed, heavy-duty training going on with this unit. We hear a lot about, gee, the amateurs went out without much training and all of this. The 8th Wisconsin in Madison got a lot of training. To conclude his comments, where he said the boys enjoy the sport very much, he also writes, some got excited and shot their rammers away, but most of them did well. Then we bring on the Eagle. There's an article from the Christian Herald, also part of this collection, and it tells the story of the Eagle that came to the regiment. Chief Sky, Chippewa Indian, made him a prisoner on the Flambeau River, according to this article, sold him to a white man for a bushel of corn. Man sold him in turn for $5 to a Mr. Mills, who made a present of him to Company C of the 8th Wisconsin. Now, without getting into huge detail, the Eagle was around for all the battles, all the skirmishes, everything that the regiment did throughout the war, and finally died. There was a fire in the Capitol in Madison. He was in the basement. There was smoke inhalation, and he was gone. But during the war, he was very active as part of this regiment, and I'll share some of that a little later on. Then we have the regiment going to St. Louis. They did not go east. They went south to St. Louis. They wanted to keep Missouri in the Union. And there were guerrillas and Confederates moving towards St. Louis, so they really wanted to hold this for the Union. So he writes, we arrived at St. Louis stopping by Barnum's Hotel, where the Honorable Simon Cameron, Secretary of War, addressed the soldiers of the 8th with a patriotic speech. My wife and child's about 8 years old now, are here in camp with me. If you were an officer, you got to keep your wife, kids, anybody who wanted to come and visit. That's what he was doing. They're in camp with me and seem to enjoy the fun, as the little girl terms it. Quite a number of men are sick from drinking the water here, myself among the rest. November 10, he writes, in the swamp near Arkansas, he's writing, 8th Wisconsin is now called here the Live Eagle Regiment. He also states, as they had been marching through Missouri, if you have any missionaries in Wisconsin, send them down here instead of India, for a more ignorant and heathenish set of people I never saw. Schoolhouses are unknown. Major Jefferson, who was third in command of the regiment, asked a woman if she had any newspapers, and she said she reckoned not. So this is the kind of thing they were running into. Now, I'm not doing a military history of the 8th Wisconsin. I'm not trying to do that today, but an outline of what they were doing for 4 years, I think, makes some sense. So let's take a quick look. To begin with, you can see, if I can get this thing to, where you go, St. Louis, where they started. They came by train south to Pilot Knob, where they wound up taking on guerrillas. The 8th Wisconsin went there. They were in combat right away because they were well trained. A lot of the other soldiers in St. Louis, they were concerned about whether or not they would be any good. The 8th Wisconsin was sent in action. Then to what was called Island Number 10 on the Mississippi River. 10 islands south of where the Ohio River comes into the Mississippi. The Confederates had set up batteries and blocked the river. So the 8th Wisconsin was part of the group under General Pope, who went there and cleared out the area. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail. Then we have, following the Battle of Shiloh, Pope's army with the 8th Wisconsin, and Britton went first to the Pittsburgh Landing and Shiloh area, and then they marched on Corinth. And they were involved in an action there. And they were involved in an action at Iuka, just to the south of Corinth. And after all of that ended, and the Confederates launched another attack on the city of Corinth, the 8th Wisconsin was back there again. So Britton recounts all of these actions as part of what was going on. That's just 1862, portions thereof. 1863, item 5 up here is Vicksburg. Major effort on the part of the North to capture Vicksburg. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. A number of you have visited all these areas, so we'll be covering familiar ground. And then the beginning of 1864, I have item number 6, what was called the Red River Expedition, where the Union Army under General Banks was supposed to go north and west and crush the Confederate resistance. They went up the river, they lost the battles, they came back down the river, and that was the end of the Red River Expedition. However, the regiment was then called back to number 7 up in St. Louis, the area. And it was, well, what's going on here? Well, there was a Confederate invasion of the state. The former governor, Sterling Price, brought a military force into Missouri. So they sent the 8th back up there to chase him out. This was part of a large military group. So the 8th spent a lot of time marching around there. They finished that. And there was another Confederate offensive coming to Nashville. It's number 8 on the map. So the 8th, again, on boats, on trains, and so forth, marched to Nashville, where they served under George Thomas, and they fought heroically in 2 days of the Battle at Nashville. So that covers what the 8th was doing, and by the time you get done, you're exhausted. This group really covered a lot of ground. There was just a lot going on here with the 8th. So our first stop then is fighting guerrillas in Pilot Knob, Missouri. And Britton is telling us about what's going on through his articles to the newspaper. From Pilot Knob, he's saying, the devils burned the bridge over the big river. Yesterday morning, they attacked 37 of our men, wounding 3 and killing 1. Our forces killed 17 of them. 2 days later, he writes, I had 10 prisoners left with me to guard. I was under the disagreeable necessity of using ropes on their hands. And I told them if we had an attack through the night, if they stirred from their position, I should commence to fire on them first. So it was, here we are. October 25, we engaged the enemy 3/4 of a mile south of town. This becomes known as the Battle of Fredericktown. Very few people have actually heard of this Battle of Fredericktown. But the regiment was actively involved in this. It was held in reserve for a time and then it saw some action. Britton writes, the enemy fired too high. We brought in their wounded by the wagon loads. The enemy was poorly armed, mostly with shotguns and rifles, and a more miserable looking set of human beings I never saw. Ragged, dirty, and looking as if provisions had been mighty scarce with them. The 8th Wisconsin has seen more hard service since she left Madison than any other regiment in the field for so short a time. The end, October 31, he's writing, from the same area. Since writing to you last, I have learned from our chief surgeon that the rebels lost and killed at Fredericktown 300. That's what I call a pretty good 2 hours work. So fairly difficult series of actions here. Island number 10. We come to early 1862, March of 1862. The 8th Wisconsin is connected with the army of General Pope. And while this is not a military history of the 8th Wisconsin, Britton played an interesting part in this situation. The point was, actually, the island number 10 is physically right here, right in the middle of the river. And then the Confederates had armed and equipped this entire area. The 8th Wisconsin with Britton was sent over, where you can see the large red arrow. And you can see federal batteries set up. So they were set up to protect the batteries and help hold that side of the river. So he's writing, rebel gunboats were shelling their works. On the west bank of the Mississippi, camp is being shelled from across the river also. Rebel battery on the opposite side of the river would throw a 32-pounder at us, and occasionally a shell. Many shells would fall short and burst in the river, but the round shot would go singing over our heads. The only damage they have done to us is to kill one horse. March 26, he writes, our old flag must be an eyesore to them. They've been trying to shoot the staff away for about 2 weeks, but it won't come down. We pick up the shot they throw at us, and as we have guns the same size as theirs, we send the same fellows back. All right? Now, the next is a very, very interesting type of comment, which we'll put this slide up. There's a shell, and you take a look at the fuse in the center. That would be, you'd set that fuse for how long you wanted the thing to burn while the shell was flying, and then when it exploded, when the fuse burned into the shell, the thing would blow up, you hoped. But Britton is writing now about Confederate shells. These are the shells they throw are poor things. About 1 in 20 explode. And you say, well, okay, what was the... Well, there's this thing in the middle. It's called a Borman fuse, and it's made out of metal. It's a tin piece. And so you would set how long you wanted the fuse to burn, you'd screw the thing in, and you'd fire it. The Confederates had real problems making Borman fuses for the first 2 years of the war. And Britain had picked up on that. So by the end of 1862, the Confederates actually gave up trying to make these fuses and went back to paper fuses that they stuck in to make the thing go. Island number 10 surrendered April 8, 1862. 7,000 prisoners were taken. So we moved to Pittsburgh Landing, close to where the Battle of Shiloh took place. And our sense today is that at the Battle of Shiloh, the Union won the battle. It was a little tough the first day, but the second day they attacked and defeated the Confederates. This is what Britton wrote about the Battle of Shiloh from the information he received, because the 8th Wisconsin wasn't there, so it was the gossip and news that he was getting. He writes that the soldiers here heap some terrible curses on the heads of our commanders at Pittsburgh Landing for letting the rebels surprise and murder our men as they did, they not having a chance of defending their lives. There is a great responsibility in some of our generals, there is no doubt. That was his read on the Battle of Shiloh. And that was the read that publicly went out from a lot of folks about the Battle of Shiloh. Now, Henry Wager Halleck, another Union general, appears, combines Grant's army and Pope's army and all the forces he can get. They get about 100,000 men together, and they take the better part of a month to march from the Shiloh battlefield to the town of Corinth, which the Confederates are trying to hold. Just east of Corinth is a place called Farmington. The 8th Wisconsin went into action at Farmington. Again, most of the histories will say, well, you know, the Confederates held Corinth for a time and then they packed up and left. There was a major skirmish battle, whatever you want to call it, at Farmington. And he writes, the 8th advanced in splendid style and opened such a deadly fire on them that they were driven from the field, talking about the Confederates. May 21, he writes, do not believe all you hear about the Illinois troops fighting. Wisconsin troops are second to none. Illinois troops had left the field when the 8th Wisconsin remained. June 4, writing of Farmington again. I don't think a regiment ever fought better than ours. We totally destroyed the 5th Tennessee, the Confederate unit, which what we did not kill, we either wounded or we took as prisoners. So this is his read on, again, this battle that occurred at Farmington. Then we get some strategic insight from this guy. Now here's a captain, a regimental captain, and it says, all right, the Confederates have retreated from Corinth. We have Halleck with his Union army of 100,000 men there. All I have to do is keep going, and a lot of good things would happen. But that's not what happened. So here's what Britton writes. Our army has been scattered around here considerably. Every little town has more or less troops in it. Our lines must extend some hundreds of miles through Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. The Union offensive just ended. And this captain had figured out what was going on. And he was obviously arguing that this was not a good thing. Well, it wasn't a good thing because the Confederates began their own offensive. So we have one Confederate offensive force under a General, Sterling Price, who wound up coming into the town of Iuka. And the Union Army recognized that here was a Confederate force in Iuka. If you send a Union force in from the south, another Union force in from the north, you crush them in the middle. That was the plan. Britton's force was on the south end of town. They came up, the shooting started. The force in the north never heard a shot. They never moved. Nothing happened. So the Confederates simply left. And that was the end of the battle at Iuka. But there's a little more to it than that. He writes about the colonel of the 8th Wisconsin, Colonel Murphy. He said, Colonel Murphy is under arrest for not finding out where Price was. Part of the problem was the 8th Wisconsin was in Iuka guarding Union supplies. And the regimental colonel had no idea that the Confederates were coming, so when they came, the 8th Wisconsin pulled out. And you can see, initially, I put a second map of Iuka. You can see the 8th Wisconsin sitting off on the side, right there. They retreated, they pulled off, and the supplies went up in smoke. Now we come to the next step. The Confederates had one piece in Iuka. Now they're going to unite their forces and go and retake the town of Corinth. The idea was the Confederate Army was unified in the north and under General Van Dorn. They were all going to come in and attack the town. You can see I have marked where the 8th Wisconsin was located. And the challenge here was, as the Confederates came in, how would the Union Army respond? Well, the Union Army did well. And for those folks who did the touring, one of the things we're going to look at are these battery positions. And Battery Robinette, for those of you who were there, is right outside of the current visitor center. You just walk out the door and the reproduction is there. And so that whole set of batteries is important for the battle itself. And he writes, long before you receive this, you'll get the news of the great Battle of Corinth, in which the enemy got terribly whipped and slaughtered. The roads are strewn for miles with guns, wagons, tents, and camp equipment. Of our regiment, 93 killed and wounded. Of my company, wounded 12. My horse was shot in the field. Now we come to the next one. I did a close-up. Again, I put Battery Robinette, and we got the 8th Wisconsin here. And again, this operational look at what the whole Army was doing. It isn't just what his company is doing, it's the whole Army. All our batteries were so arranged as to be brought to bear on one given point The terrible fire that our siege guns and field batteries opened on them along the whole line was awful to witness. Besides, thousands of infantry were engaged at the same time. The rebels charged the whole line for 2 miles, 3 times in succession, and were repulsed each time with awful slaughter. Grape and canister were poured into their ranks. At last they gave way and the whole line skedaddled. So this is what was going on in the 8th Wisconsin. I've marked the unit, and Company G I've marked with a red arrow where Britton was with that regiment at the time, was part of that counterattack. So they were able to line up the unit and send them in. And they did quite well. Now we come to the Eagle. Just spend a couple of moments talking about Old Abe the Eagle. And I'm using material here from Tim Smith, who's written the book on the Battle of Corinth. And he quotes a soldier from the 8th Wisconsin talking about Old Abe. And you can see the color guard for Old Abe in the photo. It's the former color guard. And so Old Abe is mounted on his own perch. And you got the flags encased, but they're there. That's part of the unit. And pictures of Old Abe afterwards in Madison after the war. He writes, Old Abe got loose when his tether either became untied or was shot in two. This is the soldier of the 8th writing an eyewitness report about this now. It was well known in the regiment that Confederate officers had told their men to capture or kill the bird. Price was rumored to have said that he would rather capture him than the whole brigade. The sharpshooters in gray began to fire at the circling bird as he rose higher and higher with exultant cries. The Wisconsin troops watched in horror as the bird circled the area and the Confederates shot at him. The smoke suddenly cleared, the eagle saw the gleam of the colors, and with a magnificent swoop returned to his perch beside the Union flag. The bearer received permission to take him rearward to camp. Upon examination, it was found that the eagle had been hit in the feathers, but not close enough in the body to wound him seriously. So here was Old Abe the Eagle in combat with the 8th Wisconsin, and again, throughout this 4-year period of time. What did Britton think about freeing slaves? What did he think about emancipation? In the East, particularly with the Army, the Union Army of the Potomac, it was a political deal, a lot of argument. You know, are we fighting the war to preserve the Union, or are we fighting the war to free the slaves? And what is all of this stuff? So let's follow Britton's line of thinking a little bit. And we'll find that Britton had a complete change of attitude as the war went on. You find an arrogant guy writing early, and then he changes as he begins to see reality. It's a very interesting thing here. So we jump back to 61 for his first comment where he writes, in place of a horse, I got me a $1,000 black man, the smartest one there is in the state, and it suits him to death to be a soldier. You get this arrogant sort of, you know, I've got one and it's okay. But now we come to July of 1862. There seems to be a new life in the Army since the government has decided to use the black folks to help put down the rebellion. The men are anxious to have them do their work, and if need be, to shoulder the musket. They said, the blacks, they said they were willing to take the spade or musket or whatever was given them. One man says, we've now started and we're going through, come what will. We want our liberty and we are willing to fight for it. That's a huge change in attitude. In December of 1862, so we're marching through the war here, Britton writes, I saw an incident yesterday worth mentioning. As we were marching, we met some 800 rebel prisoners taken by our advance. In our regiment is a girl, formerly a slave, and who is now cooking for some of the companies. She saw her master among the prisoners, and she gave him some crackers, which he took and appeared to be grateful for them. What changes have taken place since the war began? is change in attitude. Now we're going to take another look. We're going to talk briefly about one of the worst consequences of slavery. It's not mentioned in most books on the Civil War. People don't talk a lot about this. So I'm moving a little farther off of the PG-12 kind of presentation here. Britton writes, "The Negroes are deserting their masters by the hundreds. I have seen more than once parties of more than 500 come in. I see here we took on the job of feeding and housing not less than 3,000 of all ages, sizes, and colors. I see here every day slaves as white as myself. And this morning I saw a child and mother, and the child was as white as the whitest child in Janesville, with light straight hair and a slave. Just think that many such are here and sold in bondage." So you're talking about, and the rebel masters having sex and having this forced situation develop. It is not a nice picture. What you're looking at here, you're looking at some white kids. Well, actually, you're looking at former slaves. And they're all dressed up. And I marked the arrows. Former slaves from New Orleans. And Britton writes about this again. There are two armies moving here, the Africa Army, which keeps moving to the rear, and the U.S. Army, which is moving to the front. I also saw some more white slaves, whiter than a good many white folks I know in Janesville. Then, in June of 1863, he's camped outside of Vicksburg on the Mississippi River, and he hears about a battle between former slaves and Confederates at a place called Milliken's Bend on the Mississippi River. And he writes, "The black soldiers fought well at Milliken's Bend. I wish there were 500,000 of them in the field today." Now, how's that for a change in attitude? Total change. 500,000 of them in the field today. And this is a very pervasive practice, and we tend not to talk about this stuff. But here's a fellow, he's a major in the 8th Wisconsin, John Wales Jefferson. Well, John Wales Jefferson is the grandson of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson's slave. And after Jefferson died and a couple of the slaves' sons left, they went to Ohio. One family passed for white, and they came to Madison, Wisconsin, and that's John Wales Jefferson, the grandson. He was white. And when they signed him up for the 8th Wisconsin, so if you look at you pull out the microfilm and go through what was it like when he signed up, it says he was born in Virginia, he was 29 years old, he had gray eyes, red hair, dark complexion, and stood 6 feet 1 inch tall. And of course, Britton had no idea that this was the situation within the regiment. When you do the deep dive into who some of these folks were with these regiments, there are a number of African Americans who passed as white who fought in these regiments. And here's Britton talking about this openly to get it printed in the Janesville Daily Gazette. We come now to the end of 1862, a place called Holly Springs. U.S. Grant was advancing from the north to the south to take Vicksburg from the land side. He put all of his supplies in the town of Holly Springs. It was a single railroad line, and Holly Springs was there. The colonel of the 8th Wisconsin, Robert C. Murphy, was in charge. The 8th Wisconsin Regiment was not there, but Murphy was in charge. Well, on December 20 of 1862, Confederate general raided the place, captured the supplies, burned the town, smashed everything. Grant's offensive for 1862 was done. Colonel Murphy's headquarters there. Colonel Murphy gave up rather quickly, and Britton writes about this afterwards because this fellow was his regimental colonel. If you go back, way back to the beginning of the papers, he thinks Murphy's okay. But this is the same fellow who gave up Iuka to the Confederates. Now we give up Holly Springs, and the entire Union offensive is crushed. And he writes, I suppose long before this you've heard of Holly Springs being surrendered without much fighting. Colonel Murphy was the commander. It was a sorry-looking thing. The whole business portion of the town was destroyed, amounting to some $3 million. They were all burned by the rebels. And a little later he writes, Colonel Murphy is under arrest in Memphis for his surrender at Holly Springs. The feeling in the regiment is almost universally against him, as is that of almost the whole army. So much for Colonel Murphy. We come to 1863, to Vicksburg, and again, a number of you have been there. So this is the standard slide. To begin with, the 8th Wisconsin was actually on the west side of the river, and I'll mark that a little later. But Vicksburg was obviously the key to Confederates being able to hold the Mississippi River. It was right between island number 10 and New Orleans. You put Vicksburg in the middle in the Mississippi River, and it's very important. So they were holding. So he's writing a number of things here. First of all, in April of 1863, the regiment's on the west side digging ditches and all of this, and he said, we've just been visited by Adjutant General Thomas. He told us he was sent there by the order of Abraham Lincoln. He wants us to organize 10 Negro regiments and arm and equip them at once. He sent a dispatch to the president that he would have 20 regiments armed and equipped. And all the applications handed in for proposed officers heartily endorse the president's proclamation. And his determined policy in arming the Negro and using all honorable means to subdue traitors north or south. And these are my real sentiments, publicly expressed. April 17, he's writing, I suppose long before you receive this, you will have heard the great feat performed here by our fleet. Last night, April 16, about 11 o'clock, the movement commenced. The fleet was under continual fire as they passed south, past the batteries at Vicksburg. Now, again, here's a captain of a regiment. And now we get this operational strategic insight from this guy. He's writing for the newspaper, for the public, which is something that the Confederates hadn't figured out yet. But he's writing this for the newspaper, saying, the object of running the transports down is to cross troops below into Mississippi to operate against Vicksburg below as well as above. And we're in General Sherman's army now. Then with Sherman, he marched inland to capture Jackson, Mississippi. The regiment served as reserve for Grant at the Battle of Champion Hill. And then they participated in an assault we've got here in the north. Oops, I'm hitting the wrong buttons here. Let's back this up just a moment. Under Sherman, they participated in a major assault against the Confederate lines, and they lost. And he writes, we've just been through one of the most desperate undertakings of the war. Yesterday was selected as the day to assault the enemy's works. As we entered the ravine, all the Confederate guns were trained on the brigade, and it can better be imagined than described how the men were slaughtered as we entered the ravine. So here you've got the 8th Wisconsin going into action at Vicksburg. And for the folks who were there, you can picture the drive that would take you right to that area. Now, the regiment then returned to a place called Young's Point on the west side of the river. I've underlined Vicksburg in red, and then you've got the regiment on the west side of the river. They returned there to keep the Confederates from crossing the river, either to escape or to bring in actually water. Vicksburg surrenders July 4, 1863. Oops, I'm one slide off here somewhere. Oh, here we go. So when he gets done with this campaigning in 1863, they have covered on foot, on steamboat, on the train, 4,700 miles in the last year, year and a half that they have been traveling to do all of these things. That's a lot. Now let's see here. There we go. Now my slide of Clement Vallandigham and war protesting. And what did Britton think of these war protesters? What was his view? Again, it was this, well, are they stirring things up in the army? Do we have to worry about this? What's going on? He writes, the anti-war movement was increasing in strength, but there's an election coming in November. Now he's writing, we want one more great victory, and he's talking about they're besieging Vicksburg at the moment, that will drive every copperhead in the North to his hole. I trust that we have friend enough yet at home to drive the contemptible sneaks and traitors who are in your midst, aiding the more honorable rebels in the South. In other words, the rebels were more honorable than the copperheads and the war protesters. The soldiers will remember them. No office or trust will be given them, for we will all vote against them when we get home. He writes again from the camp and field near Vicksburg, if Illinois and Indiana could vote in the field, there would be no copperheads in the country. It would be the end of the anti-war movement. October of '63. We won't see the disgraceful assault upon American rights in the person of Vallandigham culminate in his election as governor of Ohio. Vallandigham was not elected. He lost the election. And Britton was thrilled that that was the case. The soldiers vote against such men, and so will the majority at home. Okay, now we move to 1864, this Red River expedition. I'm not going to go into this thing in detail, but to take a look at the stars next to all the dates. Britton stops writing articles for the paper in Janesville at this time. He doesn't write anything in 1864 until August. August 4th is the first time he writes anything. And one would ask, well, how come? Because the regiment was in combat. Look at all these dates, day after day after day after day for the Red River. And as soon as they finished with the Red River, then they were shipped north to St. Louis. So we have this piece again, the Missouri campaign. And again, day after day, they're marching and so forth. It's just this huge effort. And Britton is not up for writing for the newspaper at this time. He's busy. Finally, in December, we come to the Battle of Nashville. Let's see here. Here we go. At Nashville, I am safe, having been through one of the great battles of Nashville. But many poor fellows have fallen. The Nashville papers all have me wounded. But I am safe. A bullet just touched my ear, but did me no harm. We are in pursuit of the rebel army. We are constantly picking up prisoners. The regiment participated gallantly in both days' battles. There were 2 days at Nashville. The regiment was involved both of those days in heavy combat. You think, okay, we got through 1864. It's the winter of 1864. We come to 1865. The Confederates are supposed to surrender. Well, not quite. The regiment was sent to Mobile, Alabama. The fleet had taken the outer harbor of Mobile and all of this, but the forts were still occupied by the Confederates. So the regiment went into combat one more time. So then, indeed, September 5, everybody's mustered out. But we have an interesting thing that goes on with Britton as a post-war experience. So I'm going to jump ahead. There's an article written in, again, the Janesville Daily Gazette. And we have the issue of how did these soldiers who were trying to kill each other during the war, what changed after the war? They all became comrades in arms, Union and Confederate. Here's an example. So in 1881, we have a fellow by the name of J. Cole, commissary sergeant with the 8th Wisconsin Infantry, who writes this article for the Janesville Gazette. And one of the things he writes about is Colonel Britton inviting General William J. Hardee to dinner. Come to dinner. Let's sit down and chat. So they came to dinner, they sat down, they had this conversation. And obviously, I'm not going through all the details, but Cole goes through this conversation of what these two fellows were talking about. But Cole then gets to comments that Hardee makes about General Grant at Vicksburg. I think it's very interesting here. He writes, for a general to place a broad river at his back with limited supplies, press out into the interior of the enemy's territory, was the most successful campaign of all history and places General Grant as the foremost soldier of all ages. Now, okay, from a Confederate general, all right, that's saying something. And so what you have then is this coming together of these veterans following the war, which I think is quite an interesting, again, combination of things, because it became quite political. All right, the war is over. Whoops, but this is not. Let's see, here we go. So here we have Britton, picture of him post-war. What does he do? He could be sitting by his fireplace, and no. He goes back to Janesville. He has a lumber yard. He's a carpenter. He opens a furniture store. They're getting their furniture from New York. It's coming in. It's the best stuff. He's running it. And by the way, if you need a casket, he'll make it for you. It's there. This guy's a busy guy. And it's really hard to see this thing, but at the top of the slide, this ad appears in the Gazette July 10 of 1869. That was less than a year after Britton's entire operation had burned down. September 28 of 68, fire burned the lumber yard and the furniture store, so he recovered, collected his insurance, and rebuilt the whole thing within the year. He was also, again, the Janesville Fire Department's chief engineer, the fire chief. He joined the Republican Party, and he became a ward committee member in March of 1880. And then in March of 1880, he also pushed for the creation of the Wisconsin National Guard. This guy is one busy person. The Wisconsin National Guard, 1st Battalion, the newly formed Guard. Britton, at that time, was created a major, this particular unit. What else is going on in Britton's life? June of 1880, his home is burglarized. That shows up in the newspaper. His wife is in a carriage accident. Somebody else crashes their horse-driven carriage into her carriage. She was not injured, but the carriage crashed. We had that. October of 1881, Britton is involved in meetings to form the Grand Army of the Republic in Janesville, Wisconsin. He becomes an officer of that group. What else was he doing? Well, he got elected to the Wisconsin State Assembly, so he served a term in the Wisconsin State Assembly. There's a lot going on for this guy. So here we have followed him for his life. And he died December of 1910. The inscription on his monument reads, "He sleeps his last sleep, fought his last battle. No sounds can awake him to glory again." So it's been, and I have a couple other things to share, but basically it's been a privilege for me to share the story of a man who served both his country and community with courage and distinction. It's something we call patriotism now. The guy in his 30s, wife and child, goes in for 4 years of combat service. So now his record is in a more public place. It's here at the museum. And I wanted to touch on that just briefly. How did it get here? What's the background? Well, I'm going to take you to the museum website. This is not posted there just yet, but we're getting there. It's going to happen. His granddaughter, the one I mentioned earlier on, donated all of these articles to the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland in the 1920s. We got the date stamp on the papers. She died in 1925. Russell John Fay, past president of the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable, was able to get copies of all of these papers. When he passed away, then we have Paul Albus, who's in a position to acquire those copies of the papers, and he in turn, on behalf of the Milwaukee Roundtable, donated them to the museum. So now they're here. And two things are going on. One is we've got it in a large 3-ring binder, and I think probably sometime next week, if you come to the Resource Center, it's there. Don't take my word for it. Just open it up, read the record. It's all in place. On top of that, however, the next project from the museum is this. If it's January and it's snowing outside and it's a Sunday night and everything's closed, and you're saying, gee, I'd kind of like to know a little more about this Britton fellow, here's the museum website, Civil War Museum on top, and we push the button, and we come down in here, resources, archives, collections, library, and so forth. What will be happening very shortly, and the project's already started, but the Britton papers aren't here yet, is that there is a guide to the papers. All of these papers have been digitized. So we've got the 81 reports that he wrote, and I found another 16 or so that play into this, pictures and background and all of this sort of thing. All of that is digitized, and it will be here on the website. So this is something, this is, again, 160 years, it's been covered up, it's now in the open. So congratulations to him, thank you, and it's been fun.